Good afternoon, everyone. How is everybody? Yeah? Has this been awesome or what? Great, great. Well, it's good to see everybody. Welcome to just what I know is going to be a fascinating discussion with an awesome guest speaker. I cannot wait to hear everything that will be shared in the next hour, hour and a half, and to hear your questions. So I know you've been discussing at your tables, and we have put some questions at your tables. Feel free to look at those. As you think of questions during the presentation piece, please jot them down so that you don't forget what you want to ask, whether that's jotting them down on a piece of paper or your phone or by telling them to your neighbor, because we want to make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion. Today's session is Beyond Competence, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility in the 21st Century. And the goal is to help prepare and bolster us in our professional and personal success. Today's format is live streamed and recorded for future use. So hello to our remote audience today. And again, we will have questions and answers at the end. Please jot those down. We want you to share your thoughts, your inspirations, your photos about today using the hashtag. You all know what it is. What is the hashtag? Laker Leadership Conference, right? Or the QR code. And it'll populate into a photo memory ebook. I'm Maybelline Kruger. I'm the Vice President for Strategic Planning and Partnerships here at Roosevelt University. I'm also the Chief Operating Officer of our Schaumburg campus. And I am thrilled to be here with you today. And I hope you enjoyed our lunch, which was a way to celebrate Jewish American Heritage Month. I have this bio of myself I'm supposed to read, but you didn't come here to listen to me, so I'm not going to do that. I will just say this. I have been in higher education for over 40 years. Please look surprised. Thank you. And it is presentations like this that keep me going. You know, what I know about education is the more we learn, the more we realize we have so much more to learn, right? And it's why I'm thrilled to be here today and participate, and in particular, hear our guest presenter today. Today's presentation is a discussion of key concepts, sustainable efforts, and designing impactful diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility strategies. And again, we know you've already started the conversation at your tables, but whether you call it diversity and inclusion, equity and inclusion, inclusion and belonging, or any number of key phrases, one thing is for certain, it's trending in a big way. But the question is, what does it look like beyond flashy statements, right? Or box checking compliance? I am thrilled to introduce today's speaker. Elizabeth J. Stigler, PhD, is an intersectional diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility advocate dedicated to empowering individuals and communities to see themselves as agents for change. Dr. Stigler is thrilled to serve as the inaugural director of the Community Equity Research Center at CASTLE, which is the Chinese American Service League, where she oversees organization-wide DEI efforts, government and policy work, as well as the Anti-Hate Action Center. It's fascinating work. I encourage you to spend some time talking with Liz a little bit after this. You'll learn a lot in a brief conversation. In 2018, she earned her PhD with honors in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies from the University of Kansas, and brings over a decade of experience writing, researching, and teaching about identity-based oppression and systemic injustice to her current work. Dr. Stigler holds 2 master's degrees in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, one from the University of Kansas and one from Roosevelt University, as well as a bachelor's in Women's Studies from Augustana College. As a queer person with an invisible disability, the work of inclusion and equity is a deeply personal pursuit for her. Thank you, Dr. Stigler, for being here with us today. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much. There we go. Hello. It's always strange to hear yourself introduced. It feels like, wow, who's that person they're talking about? Like, that's nice. They did all those things. Yes. So good afternoon. Thank you all so much for having me. I am very, very excited. Please keep lunching. We're going to flex the lunch and learn muscles today. Do the lunching. Totally okay. This session is sort of a training, right? And so I'm going to try to leave a lot of time for interactivity, for engagement, for questions. So that's sort of the thing that I'm excited about doing. So because this is a training, right, and I have never met a goal setting tool that I didn't like, we're going to have sort of our goals for the session today, right? Perhaps obviously, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is a huge umbrella, right, of topics, of concepts, of histories that cannot fully be covered in just one short hour. So what I'm hoping to do is sort of our first goal here, right? Help you gain an introductory knowledge of diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, belonging, justice, right, et cetera, et cetera. Have a clear understanding of sort of what someone means, right, when they say equity, inclusion. I'd really think about what does that mean for you, right? Setting your own personal understanding and alignment of what those words mean. The second goal I'm hoping, right, is that we'll help you identify some opportunities to be a DEIA ambassador at work or in your own professional settings. So by no means does DEIA live only at work, but because of the theme of the conference, this is about leadership, it's about professional development. We're going to be specifically thinking and talking about DEIA efforts in a professional space. And I'm focusing most of my energy and insights on sort of what that looks like for myself and hopefully for you, right? And so hopefully when you leave here, you can have a few ideas about how you can get plugged into DEIA efforts at your own job, or how you can jumpstart efforts if there are not anything happening at your job, or if you're job hunting, what are some of the things that you can look for if you're trying to find a DEIA culture that fits you and aligns with what you want. And lastly, when you sat down, you should all have this fun, flirty little piece of paper, your DEIA roadmaps. Yes, at your tables. So not required, but we are hopefully going to draft a little bit of your roadmap. So thinking about your own focus area, right, for the next 12 months, thinking about some goals you want for yourself. So as we go along, there'll be places to reflect and plug in content on the roadmap. So helping you identify your own goals, strengths, shadow areas, and opportunities for growth. So before we jump in, I want to tell you a little bit about myself, right? So this is my wonderful cat, Butch. He's screaming in that photo, right? I, as Maybelline so generously said, I am the inaugural director of the Community Equity Research Center at CASEL, which is the Chinese American Service League here in Chicago. And so quick, I'll give you a rundown and a plug for CASEL. CASEL, and I also brought some flyers and business cards if you want to talk to me, but CASEL is the largest AANHPI serving nonprofit in the Midwest. In 2021, we served over 6,000 individual clients. We have 27 different program areas, and we provide comprehensive wraparound services, everything from early childhood education through adult day services and everything in between, legal, citizenship, adult education, employment, housing. We kind of do it all. And importantly, we serve everyone. So you do not have to be Chinese or AANHPI to be a client, and you don't have to be Chinese or AANHPI to work at CASEL. And we have a number of openings. So in a number of departments, right? We're looking for clinicians, development folks, my own personal team is hiring, data analysts. So if you're looking, please do feel free to check us out, and feel free to reach out to me, let me know, right? Hey, I saw this, I saw you at Roosevelt, and I'll see what I can do. So as the director of the Community Equity Research Center, I oversee, as was mentioned, our DEIA efforts externally and internally, our government and policy work, and our Anti-Hate Action Center. And so the flyer that's on your tables is specifically for our Anti-Hate Action Center. So if you have experienced or witnessed a hate crime, please feel free to call or to, email the number there, check out the website, and it is in simplified Chinese on the back. So again, that's a resource that I always say I wish we didn't have to have, but we do, right? So please do feel free to share that information widely. And the Anti-Hate Action Center not only provides direct victim support, but it also aims to structurally eradicate anti-Asian attacks and hate more broadly. So I've been at CASEL for about a year, and I am very, very, very lucky to love what I do. And the reason I say that I'm lucky is because that's not always been the case for me, right? I have not always loved what I did. So special shout out to anybody in the room. If you're struggling to find what you want to do, if you're not sure what's next, if you're in a job that you don't love, I understand. I've been there, right? So I definitely, see and hear you. And as was mentioned, all my degrees, right? My path to DEIA is a little unconventional. All my degrees through my bachelor's, through my PhD are all in women, gender, and sexuality studies. So for me, that means that I sort of come to this work from an intersectional social justice perspective. And when I was doing my PhD at the University of Kansas, that's when I started doing some sort of freelance, DEIA related trainings and consulting for local nonprofits and other organizations that needed different education or curriculum opportunities. And as a queer person with an invisible disability, a lot of what I started sort of teaching and developing was based on my own experience, right? My own lived experience, my own knowledge, my own interests. And as I progressed, I did some more freelance work with both nonprofits and with privately owned businesses, helping develop strategic plans, educational and training goals, and just general one-off trainings. So after I earned my PhD in 2018, and that is my lovely wife, Astor, at my PhD Hooding. She is actually the training and education manager for the Anti-Violence Project at the Center on Halsted. So our entire house does this work. So you can ask us about our self-care plan. It's not good, but we have it. I held a number of positions in higher ed in pretty rapid succession. And then when COVID-19 hit, I was a faculty member at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And COVID sort of helped crystallize for me what I knew, but didn't really want to say. And that was that I really wanted to make DEIA work my full-time work and not just my side hustle. So I made the super scary decision to switch career paths and leave higher ed. I call myself a reformed academic. And somehow I was lucky enough to land at Castle. And I tell you all of that, not just because I want you to know all about my fun, flirty life adventures, but because to say the way that I come to the work of DEIA is deeply informed by my commitment to and training in intersectional social justice. So which for me, that means that I'm motivated to center the needs of folks who are facing multiple overlapping forms of oppression and radiate support outwards, right? Because centering the most marginalized means that everyone will benefit. This is sort of sometimes referred to as the curb cut effect. I don't know if folks are familiar with this, but the curb cut effect, right? So initially, curb cuts in the sidewalk was developed as a way to help folks who use wheelchairs to more easily cross the street. But surprisingly to probably no one in this room, turns out more people benefit from curb cuts, right? So folks with strollers, delivery folks on bicycles, folks pushing heavy packages. Curb cuts beneficial to folks, not just people with disabilities. So the curb cut effect is a really good example of designing a solution for a particular sort of set of folks with particular needs and resources that actually benefits a lot of folks. So I come to this work because I'm motivated by the belief that liberation is possible if we work together. So that shows up, for example, in Castle's DEIA efforts in a number of ways. So first of all, when I came on board last June, it was just DEI. I like to joke that there's the silent A. And so I made a case that we needed to center access and accessibility, that is as critical to our work of equity and inclusion as all the other letters. And so now it's DEIA, right? And if you're interested, this is sort of the homepage for the Community Equity Research Center. You can read more about what we do at castleservice.org/equity. And when I was interviewing for this job, I was really upfront with my CEO. And I said, if you hire me, we're going to have hard conversations. We're going to have conversations that you don't want to have. And I promise, we will. And, I kind of knew I was in the right place because not only in that moment did he say, great, I welcome that, but over the past year, when I've said, okay, Paul, we're going to have some conversations you're not going to like, he has always made time for it. He's engaged in it. And we've worked through the ideas together. So, and for me, as a DEIA practitioner, that's super important because I'm really not interested in just sort of the surface level efforts, or something that looks good optically, but doesn't make a lot of change. That's not really what I'm here for. So we'll talk more about sort of that and different approaches to the work throughout the presentation. But there are as many ways to approach DEIA work as there are, ice cream flavors or paint colors. I mean, it's endless, right? People approach the work in a number of different ways. And knowing your own personal anchor point will help you align your efforts with a workplace or an organization that speaks the same language, for lack of a better word. So speaking of language, Let's talk about some shared language, right? Before we get any further on, I want to provide some shared definitions here. One of the questions that was on your sort of lunchtime question sheet was, what does DEIA mean to you, I think, or how do you define DEIA? And, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there's no one answer, right? So there's no right answer for any of those terms. And that also means that it means something different to every person, to every organization, everywhere defines these concepts differently. So it's really important to understand what exactly your job or your organization means when they say diversity, equity, inclusion, or accessibility. So these are sort of the Castle terms, and I can go back, but this is the definitions that the DEIA committee came up with collectively last September. And this is, really, we wanted to have a clear definition that we could communicate to our colleagues. So when we say diversity at Castle, this is what we mean, right? There was no confusion. We knew exactly what we meant, so everyone could be aligned with our efforts. And so for us, when we think about diversity, it's about moving beyond simple tolerance, right? And that's why sort of the title of the talk, right, Beyond Competence, is we're not just tolerating people who are different. Diversity really means respect and appreciation, and hopefully celebration for us at Castle, right? And equity, and here's, where I'm testing your lunch brains, right? So is equity the same thing as equality? Are those the same words? No, good, thank you. Sometimes people are like, oh, I hope she doesn't look at me. No, yes, right, they're not the same, right? Equity and equality, not the same thing. Sounds like they should be related, sounds like they should be the same thing. They're not, right? And when we think about equity, and this is the big reason why having shared definitions is important, because if you don't clearly define what equity means for you or your organization or your efforts, you might have people laboring under the assumption, right, that equality, which is just everybody gets the same thing, is the same thing as equity, right? And equity is acknowledging we're not all starting from the same place. There are specific resources and supports that we need to shore up the parity in opportunity and access that other folks have experienced. So differentiating between those two things, right, is super important, because you don't want your colleagues or yourself to be laboring under one assumption of equity and then come to find out in 8 months, people are thinking about it as equality. And for us, inclusion and accessibility, similarly very important, right? Inclusion for us, some folks talk about inclusion as sort of the result of diversity, right? If you have a strong diversity program, inclusion is the result. I guess that can work. I think about it more as the action, right? Inclusion is the action of continuously, repeatedly cultivating an environment where folks feel valued and affirmed and supported. So I don't think inclusion is necessarily the result of anything in particular, but it is work on its own that sort of talks about, how we show up and have that empowered participation in the workplace. And then we included accessibility because we really wanted to be clear about what that means for us, right? That accessibility is about how successfully navigating an environment, whether that's your built environment, whether that's the digital environment, really making sure that clients and colleagues have what they need to successfully navigate and adapt to their environment. And as you can see, for us, it was really important. We borrowed a lot of language, right? So you can see in these definitions, we borrowed language from the Annie Casey Foundation, from Noble Charter Network, from the National Center on Accessible Education Materials, because we wanted to know what other organizations that were aligned with our mission and vision, what had they defined these terms as, right? How had they defined these words? And that was really useful for the committee, especially if you're working in an organization or a place where your DEIA efforts are new. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can look and find the resources that are out there and figure out, how do I introduce them to my boss, to my colleagues, to my team? So I would encourage you maybe throughout this presentation, but also after, to think about your own personal definitions of each of these words. What does diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility mean to you? How does it show up in your life? What are the key words that you think about? Because if you have a clear understanding of what it means for you, it will help you understand and see if you are aligned with your workplace commitment to DEIA, right? So if your understanding of inclusion is more similar to the definition here, but your employer thinks inclusion is like everyone gets invited to a picnic and gets a t-shirt, right? Then that's a misalignment. And one of you is going to be dissatisfied, right? So really understanding what it is when you say these terms helps you to sort of identify an environment where you will be aligned with those goals overall. I'll also add that the DEIA landscape might include belonging, as we've talked about. It could also include justice. So you might see, DEIB or DEIAJ or DEIJ, different efforts. Belonging is, was not something we included here because we felt inclusion sort of captured it. Justice is more often going to show up in mission-driven organizations. If there are other terms out there, I'm sure there are, because it sort of is an ever-growing umbrella of concepts and terms. So now that we've sort of established some of the definitions, I'm going to talk a little bit about a brief history of diversity and how it shows up at work. Excuse me, in our current working condition, DEIA is super trendy, right? As I mentioned, very on trend, very hot, but it's really actually relatively new culturally, historically speaking. So if we look back to sort of the 60s and 70s, it's clear that initial diversity training efforts focused almost entirely on legislation and compliance. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal for employers with more than 15 employees to discriminate in hiring, termination, promotion, job training, or any other term on the basis of a number of dimensions of identity. So as you can imagine, the response to Title VII in the workplace was a scramble to provide rapid fire trainings in response largely to EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission lawsuits. So if EEOC found that there was probable cause for discrimination from a complainant, one of the acts of remediation they might suggest or mandate was instituted a court-ordered mandate for offending organizations to provide some kind of anti-discrimination training for its employees. The focus of those kinds of trainings tended to be purely compulsory and focused on litigation, and was often a long list of do this, don't do this, right? The main focus being on ensuring that the company didn't get sued. So most organizations offered this training as a one-time event, and it was usually accompanied by a form you had to sign that was like, I won't be racist, right? So that was, you had a 1-hour training, you are not racist, thank you very much. That's sort of what that looked like, attesting that they understood the anti-discrimination policies. And this might come as a shock to you, but it turns out those mandated trainings were not actually effective, right? Didn't actually do a whole lot of good there. Based on the research we know now, mandated trainings can actually activate bias and prejudice, right? So when you are required to complete a DEIA or anti-racism training, it can actually activate your bias or prejudice, right? So I like to say that you can't mandate inclusion and you can't outlaw bias, and we know that now. And so the opposite of what it was intended to do was actually happening. And that could have been for a number of reasons, right? What was then referred to, right, the early trainings were focused almost entirely on what was referred to as racial minorities and women. And so folks who were not in those groups either got the false impression that there was preferential treatment, right? So things like affirmative action, right, disprivileges white people, or reverse racism, these concepts that are not real, came out of a lot of these initial trainings that said, well, this is what we're focusing on, right? And additionally, a lot of these initial trainings, as I said, were this long do's and don'ts, didn't really focus on how any of this was relevant to your day-to-day work. So if you sit through an hour and it's just, do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this, there's no connection to your day-to-day work, not super relevant, right? It's not really going to stick with you. So there's no long-term connection there. And so if we're moving along then, we see the 1980s as primarily focused on assimilation. And we can thank good old President Reagan and his love of deregulation for the 1980s sort of trainings. He appoints Clarence Thomas as the head of the EEOC. And Thomas says, we don't need to have government mandated affirmative action or diversity timetables or goals, right? Let businesses set their own goals. And so what you think is going to happen happens. A lot of organizations decide they roll back their DEIA efforts. We don't need to do trainings. We don't need to, have an anti-discrimination policy. We're doing okay, right? So the vast majority of organizations just sort of stopped their efforts, but they did turn to offering assimilation trainings that were for women and primarily, again, underrepresented colleagues who they assumed did not have the management capacity because they had not previously been trained in those skills. So that's sort of the assimilation training that we start to see being offered in the 1980s. And then in 1987, a report from the Hudson Institute, which was titled Workforce 2000, shifted the landscape. This report was the first time that the phrase workforce diversity showed up into the lexicon. And a number of things that this report did that was really exciting, right? So that phrase latched onto, you still hear it today. And then 1990, Roosevelt Thomas made the argument that recruitment was not the issue, right? It wasn't that we had a diversity recruitment issue, we had a retention issue, we had a training issue. So historically underrepresented people were being recruited for roles and then never provided the training they needed to succeed. So high turnover, and the green grass grows all around, right? So that's what happens. So the new emphasis on workforce diversity and the relevance of training led to a variety of different approaches to try and correct the issue. Everything ranging from sort of aggressive guilt-inducing sessions to everything is wonderful, we're all happy, inclusive people sessions that didn't really address the problem. All those things were happening. Despite this heightened focus on what's called cultural sensitivity, in 1999, there was a class action lawsuit filed against Coca-Cola for racial discrimination. So it was a number of colleagues who alleged that they experienced a pattern of racial discrimination at Coca-Cola. The lawsuit was settled for $192 million. That was a really visible, highly public lawsuit. And so a lot of CEOs were instantly afraid, right? Terror just everywhere, right? If Coca-Cola can get sued, we can get sued too. So there was a greater emphasis shown to, inclusion showing up, right? Inclusion has entered the chat is what I call this here. So there was the emphasis not just on diversity, but on that inclusion piece. And so we see the business case for diversity show up around this time. And the business case for diversity is not my best friend, but a lot of people talk about it. You'll hear some DEIA consultants make the case that diversity is good for business. And that usually means it's good for finances. And yes and no is the answer there, right? So some of the statistics that come through on DEIA in a business case is that, well, it'll increase revenue, it increases creativity on teams, and that's a maybe, right? But the assumption that that happens immediately, right? You institute a diversity training program, you institute a diversity recruitment pipeline, and suddenly we have wildly creative teams, and we have, millions of dollars just flooding in, is not how it happens, right? Predictably, you see a decline first, especially in organizations and environments that have not had diversity programs before. When you suddenly institute them, there's a decline, there's a drop, and then there's an incline if you do it right. But that's not the part that is talked about a lot. So if you sell a business or an organization on the business case for diversity, and then the results don't look immediately awesome, it tends to sour how they think about it, right? So I have a nebulous feeling about the business case for diversity, but that's my prerogative and it's my talk, so I get to say what I want. So then as we approach the 2010-ish, you see many organizations began testing the temperature of their culture and their workforce. So employee engagement surveys, seeing how employees are doing, how they're feeling. And it turned out that a lot of folks were feeling bad, especially a lot of historically underrepresented colleagues, not having a great time at work. So some employers expanded a more consistent DEI offerings, whether it was trainings, whether you see the creation of employee resource groups, there became sort of more of a tendency to appoint a chief diversity officer or a diversity lead or whatever it was, which was usually an HR professional or someone within sort of the HR world who shared the responsibilities of both diversity and recruitment. And then these sort of last two were a little more nebulous, but 2018 to present, DEIA, super trendy, right? Certainly since 2020, we've seen a number of organizations throw a lot of effort and money at DEIA statements and held virtual town halls to sort of talk about, racial discrimination and racism in America. But even preceding 2020, there was a real palpable fervor around DEIA. So organizations were eager to put together DEIA committees, make promises to their employees that they were creating a culture of belonging and they wanted everyone to be a part of it, and bring your whole selves to work. And there was a lot of rhetoric around what that looks like. And as someone who's been working in the DEIA space for a long time, I can tell you that I have not seen the sort of boom in DEIA related job postings and social media postings and LinkedIn postings. I've never seen anything like it in the past 4 years. So it's hard to scroll through anything without seeing a company or someone posting their diversity statement or shouting out their efforts or, tagging themselves as change makers or innovators or disruptors or, fill in the blank of whatever they're using. And then quickly, just last year, right? Yay, accessibility. The White House issued a proclamation on DEIA that specifically included accessibility, and it made a mandate for all federal offices and agencies to develop a DEIA strategic plan and goals that address the specific gaps in diversity, equity, and accessibility. So the recent explosion in DEIA visibility and trendiness has led us to our current state, which I like to think of as the diversity industrial complex. If you just take a look at these numbers, right? So $7.5 billion was spent on DEI in the US in 2020, projected to hit $14.5 billion in the next 4 years. Between September 2019 and September 2020, job postings in DEI have risen 56%. And then these two from the Sequoia Consulting Group, there's been a 9% increase in the creation of ERGs in 2021. And 70% of companies have introduced new DEI programming since 2020, right? And I didn't include this statistic on there because I didn't want to have too much text, but a recent survey also showed that of contemporary millennial and Gen Z job seekers, 79% will not consider an employer that doesn't have a dedicated DEIA commitment. And sort of the contours of what commitment means are a little opaque, but that's just something to think about, right? And in this super competitive job market, it is clear that employers cannot afford to not have some kind of DEIA programming. And I imagine, right, this is probably part of the talk where you think, well, isn't this great, right, Dr. Stigler, this is a good thing, 7.5 billion, right, we're gonna hit 14.5 billion, 56% increase. There's an increase in DEI spending, there's an increase in DEI jobs, isn't this great? And I would say, but yes and no. And here's why, right? So the influx of dollars into DEI spending are for the most part not being allocated into the spaces where resources are most needed to shore up equity gaps. So in a fall 2021 report from the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, they were looking specifically at a Wall Street Journal article published in September of 2020 that claimed that in the wake of George Floyd's murder, there were $6.5 billion committed to achieving racial equity that year, which dwarfed the approximately $3.3 billion that had been committed for the past 8 years combined. However, according to this report from the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, they found that that amount was vastly overstated and mischaracterized. So based on their analysis of the available data, there was only 1.5 billion in awarded grants focused on racial equity. So further, many of the intended pledges were questionable. So if we look at Facebook, who pledged a staggering $1.1 billion commitment to funding racial equity, the fine print there was that only $100 million would be cash grants to Black creators, nonprofits, and small businesses. And the other $1 billion was internally allocated. So Facebook funding themselves, right? Congratulations, pat on the back, $1 billion for racial equity. And they're far from alone, right? So a lot of organizations were doing that. And so I think about the diversity industrial complex, and this is a quote from Dean Spade's Normal Life. When we think about an industrial complex, right? The terms that he uses here, industrial complex, like military or prison industrial complex, are pointing to a kind of multi-vector analysis of law, power, knowledge, and norms. And I think about the diversity industrial complex in the way that oral historian and archivist Kimberly Springer talks about it when she says that the diversity industrial complex makes overtures towards diversity without acknowledging that the conversations and demands of marginalized communities have moved well beyond mere tokenization, right? She goes on to say that organizations and individuals invested in framing discrimination as apolitical tolerance for difference through linguistically downplaying bigotry, social norms, and business practices while avoiding historical context of power and oppression, right? So the diversity industrial complex, main goal there, avoiding lawsuits, making sure employees feel happy at work. There's just like a calm environment, right? Not psychological safety, but just like you're happy, right? You're not hostile. Free from harassment, no lawsuits, right? That's sort of all the money that's being funneled into the diversity industrial complex. So that's why back when I started speaking with you, I made it clear that I come to this work from a place of intersectional social justice because my goal and my responsibility as a DEI practitioner is to measurably impact systems change and to dismantle structural oppression. My goal is not to avoid a lawsuit, right? Like, that's not my goal. My goal is not to make more money. My goal is not to make everybody feel happy all the time. That's just not really how I come to it. And more organizations are looking to hire DEIA professionals. So it's super important for you if you're going into this work to think about what is your own commitment, right? How are you going to show up? Do you want to be working for an organization that has a commitment that is mostly about, avoiding lawsuits? Or, as Roosevelt students, I imagine you're more interested in social justice, but maybe not. And so very important, I think, are two questions here that might be useful as you look at your roadmap. And that's thinking about why does this work matter to you and how will you show up to this work, right? And so when I think about, why does this work matter? It's really important to find your why, right? You need an anchor and a lantern, something that guides you and something that holds you grounded in this work. Because if you're doing DEIA work effectively, sustainably for an organization, if you're helping an organization start DEIA efforts, it's very exhausting and you will burn out really quickly if you're not super clear on why you're invested in doing this work, right? What does this mean? And how will you show up is thinking about how do you present in DEIA spaces, right? As a white cisgender person, I'm very conscious of the way that I show up in DEIA spaces, right? There are some spaces where there is absolutely, there is doubt about my actions, there is doubt about my credibility, as there should be, right? Because until I prove that I'm actually there to do the work I said I was going to do, what does it matter, right? So being sort of clear with yourself, having a high level of self-awareness is really useful if you're thinking about why do you want to enter this work, what do you want to do, and how do you show up to this work? So once you've sort of thought about that, I want to turn our attention to thinking about some of the nuts and bolts of really doing DEIA work. So as I mentioned, it can be really stressful, it can be demoralizing, there can be burnout really quickly if you don't have a good underpinning. So in my experience, effective DEIA efforts at a variety of organizations have these three things in common, right? They're strategic, it's clearly articulated to your daily work, and there's full buy-in from leadership. And when I say strategic, I mean, ideally, there is a multi-year plan, right, that has phases, that has goals, that has assessment metrics. For example, in my work at Castle, right, as I mentioned, I've been there for about a year. So we're in phase 1, and that for us looks like focusing on community impact and inclusive workplace. Our phase 2 includes workforce. Our phase 3 includes supplier diversity. If we tried to do it all at once, I probably would have slept less than I did in the last 12 months, and we wouldn't be anywhere closer to achieving our goals. So having a strategic plan that can help guide you, and that includes assessment metrics, right? It doesn't have to be, the sort of one-to-one performance metrics that we're more familiar with, but how are you going to gauge what a successful DEIA effort looks like for your committee, your organization, your company, right? What is it that you're trying to help folks do? That strategic plan is going to help guide you and help you figure out what does it look like for us to be, an equity or an inclusive company. Critical to your daily work, right? Like we talked about, initial compliance-driven training is not successful because it doesn't articulate how DEIA is important or relevant for your day-to-day work. So when you think about that, think about making it not an add-in, right? It's not like, oh, if we have time for that DEIA stuff, we'll add it in. It has to be part of the critical day-to-day work, right? At Castle, we came up with organization-wide 5 reasons why DEIA is critical to the work we do every day. And then each department came up with their own reason why and how it was important to the specific work that they do. So everybody understands not only how this is guiding our commitment institutionally, but specifically to the work that you do or that our team does with children or with seniors or with families every day. So really clear, everybody's on board, and it helps to align you to that strategic commitment. And then finally, full buy-in from leadership, right? The research shows us that DEIA efforts have to be from the top, right? They have to be modeled from the top down to be successful. So you need to have a DEIA either committee or officer or some way that you can convince your senior leadership that they need to model equity, right? That they need to be sort of aligned with these efforts and leading the charge for their teams in a lot of different ways. So if you're thinking about your own workplace, right, which I hope you are, or thinking about, if you are looking for work, I think some of the things to look at here are there any formal DEIA efforts taking place at your job, right? So is there a committee or a hiring statement or anything, right? Is there someone maybe who is a professional or someone who is leading these efforts, the head of a committee? Someone who's been appointed as, sort of the person who's in charge of DEIA efforts. Also, does your employer have a DEIA committee or council, right? What does that look like? Is it open to membership? Is it a lot of folks? Is it not a lot of folks? Are there any ERGs, employee resource groups, sometimes also called business resource groups or affinity resource groups, right? Looking at ERGs and what kind of ERGs you have, are there ones that are missing, right? Or do you feel that there is a representation there that it has a significant impact on your colleagues that is not represented in the ERG space? And if there are efforts taking place, where do they live, right? By which I mean, what is their home department? So it's not always clear, but let's say your DEIA efforts are housed in your HR department, right? You can probably, but not always, assume that there's going to be an emphasis on education, on training, on recruitment, on retention, right? If that's where DEIA is housed, that's probably going to be the higher priorities for the organization. It's not super common, but if your DEI efforts are housed in your legal department, right, it's probably going to be more focused on EEOC, maybe on workplace discrimination, could be on supplier diversity, but some of those more sort of litigation nuts and bolts pieces. My favorite time is when DEIA is in its own department, right? So it lives on its own. And for me, that usually means that it's viewed comprehensively and holistically, right? So it's not sort of shoved into an existing department that's sort of retrofitted to also be about inclusion. but it lives on its own somewhere, right? It has its own standalone priorities. Fingers crossed, it has its own budget, right? That's always nice to know. And hopefully it has the capacity to set its own goals, right? So that's, in my humble opinion, it usually is the most impactful when it lives on its own. So quick note, right, about ERGs and DEIA committees. If there are DEIA committees or ERGs at your workplace, or if you're thinking about starting them, nice to have just some do's and don'ts, because it can be pretty easy to fall into some pitfalls here. At their best, DEIA committees and ERGs can be collaborative, right? They're workspaces, they're opportunities for learning and growth. They can really help you to have an input in the development of workplace policy. They're accountability partners, right? So if your organization has said we are going to commit to being an anti-racist organization, the DEIA committee has the capacity to hold the organization accountable to achieving its goals. But they're not a number of things that are sort of easy traps to fall into. Those committees or ERGs are not solely responsible for making policy, right? So they're not going to be the group that sets and says, this is our goal, right? They can be involved in policy making, but they're not a policy body on their own. They're not complaint repositories, right? If you've ever been in a group of folks, it can really quickly devolve into complaining about whatever is, happening at your organization or with your friends or with your family, whatever it is, right? And it can be really hard to pull ERGs or DEIA committees out of that complaint mindset if that's where they're living, right? They're also not party planners. There can be events that your DEIA committees or ERGs do, but if you're on an ERG and the sole function of the ERG is to plan, the annual Christmas party every year, I got news for you, pals. It's probably not the most effective ERG for your professional development, right? So think about how are you enabling those resources, or how are you, sort of showing up in those spaces? And if there is an ERG that's sort of fallen into party planning city, how can you kind of help to turn the tide if you're interested in do that, right? They're not the final say on all things DEIA, and they're not substitutes for systemic and structural DEIA efforts, right? So just creating an ERG or just creating a DEIA committee or council is not going to solve the problems of the organization, right? If they say, but we have a DEI committee, look here, right? We have it. That's not enough, right? It has to be a piece of the effort. And so if you're thinking about getting started, right, this is a nice place to think about your DEIA roadmap. What's your focus for the year? What are some of your goals? Here are just some opportunities, some places that you might think about seeing yourself. And these are some roles, not exhaustive, right? Not a full spread, but some roles that you might consider if you're thinking about how to get started. Are you someone who's a workplace ambassador or a champion, right? So this is going to be someone who loves to attend DEIA events. They promote DEIA efforts in the workplace. They're a member of an ERG or a committee. DEIA is not the primary function of this person's job, right? So you just go to events, you're on the committee, you like to promote, you do a lot of talking with your colleagues, you're a supporter, right? It is a thing that you are interested in doing. It's not the primary function of your job. This is a great place to start, especially if you're new to DEIA, right? Or if you want to dip your toes in the efforts of what does this look like in the workplace? How can I maybe be involved? Being a workplace ambassador or a champion, great place to start. Maybe you feel more called to be a committee lead, right? So this is someone who has a leadership role within an ERG or within a DEIA committee or council. If you're feeling like you might be a committee lead or that's how it fits for you, you're someone who is comfortable with guiding the work of a committee. So you understand the organizational DEIA priorities, you can see the core values, and you can comfortably see how your role on a committee can guide that work to support and align with the overall organizational strategy, right? Ideally with the larger DEIA strategic plan. You're someone who can confidently and effectively function as a liaison between the committee and senior leadership. So a function there is taking what happens in the committee or sharing what happens in ERG and communicating it to senior leadership and saying, we'd really like to do this, or this has emerged, or we're going to do this equity assessment, right? If you're thinking about being a committee lead, having that communication capacity is really key, right? And some action words that I think about here are someone who can operationalize, who can communicate, who can really implement these overall larger structures within a committee setting. Or maybe you're thinking about being someone who's a DEIA director or DEIA lead or whatever it might be called at your organization. This is someone like me, right? Ideally, you're an experienced DEIA practitioner. You have experience in change management, by which I mean not necessarily a DEIA process, but you're someone who has helped an organization through a big change, whether that's a change in the HR system, whether that's a change in leadership, whether that's a whole new strategic plan that includes DEIA. You're someone who has actively participated in that process. You have a demonstrated capacity to design strategic plans with multiple moving parts, right? As I mentioned, all the phases of Castle's DEIA strategic plan, it's a lot to hold in your head, right? And sort of being in a DEIA leadership position, you really want to be someone who is a strategic thinker, who has that vision to think about how is this showing up in a year or 2 years, or where do we want to be 5 years down the road, right? You're someone who has the ability to cultivate buy-in from your senior leadership peers and from C-suite, C-suite, and above level folks. So really being able to communicate how and why DEIA is part of the imperative for the organization. And importantly, and this is something that I think people are always surprised to learn about my job, the percentage of time I spend reading, right, is just massive, right? Extensive knowledge of current DEIA best practices, reading books, reading articles, listening to TED Talks, right? There's so many things to keep track of. So if you're looking to cultivate yourself as a DEIA leader, these are some of the skills that I would, suggest that you really try to focus on. And finally, and this is not, like a hierarchy. It's not like if you're a good DEIA director, you get to be a consultant, right? That's not sort of how it works. But if you're someone who feels like maybe doing DEIA consulting work is more interesting for you, the sort of benefit here is that you get an insider-outsider status. So you can sort of show up in an organization, you're there for a short period of time, and you're able to very quickly impact a lot of change. So the skills that you need to do that, though, are that you can design a system and a structure that will be successful when someone else implements it, right? Because you won't be there for the 3-year, the 4-year, maybe even the 1-year strategic plan. So as a consultant, you really need to be skilled in that full sort of life cycle organization development and assessment, and be able to sort of pinpoint the pain points and the areas of opportunity for an organization and help them design a strategy that can assess and build success, even if you're not there anymore, right? So this is just something to think about. We're almost done. I know your brains are probably full of absolute information, but moving forward here, I think it's important to do sort of a personal DEIA inventory. This is kind of like a SWOT analysis, but less technical. And think about, what are you knowledgeable about, right? So what could you confidently teach to someone else? If you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy of learning, this is the teaching part, right? What could you teach? What's a concept you're so confident in, you can teach it? What am I curious about, right? So that might be something that you've heard about. Maybe that's like I've heard something about intersectionality, and I think it has to do with difference, but I'm not super sure, right? You're not fully informed. You couldn't teach it to someone. What are your shadow areas, right? And that's a word or concept or idea that is entirely new to you, right? So maybe something that I have said in the last hour, maybe diversity industrial complex, right, is new for you. And you're like, I literally don't know what that is. I heard it once, can't tell you anything else about it, right? That's a shadow area. And then my favorite are the unknown unknowns. And those are things that you don't know that you don't know. And they usually pop up at really inopportune times when you have failed to consider them, and suddenly they're there demanding to be considered, right? Maybe you planned an event and it's a DEIA committee event and you're super excited about it because you've got a really accessible venue with accessible entrances and accessible bathrooms. And somebody says, but there's no gender neutral bathroom, right? And then you're like, shit, right? Like I didn't know I had to plan that. That's an unknown unknown, right? And no matter how long you've been doing this work, there's always going to be unknown unknowns, right? So just be flexible, give yourself grace, and prepare as best you can to try to avoid those and to deal gracefully with them when they show up. So making a plan, right? You want to identify your resources, books, podcasts, TED Talks, movies. There's a ton of stuff out there. DEIA practitioner landscape scan. Again, this has never been easier, right? Go on LinkedIn, search for organizations that are doing the work that is aligned with your why, right? Remember like 6 slides ago when we talked about why are you doing this work? Find organizations, find practitioners that align with your why, and then follow them, right? Look at how they're doing what they're doing. Look at the training that someone who is doing the DEIA work that you want to be doing. Where did they start? How did they develop? What does that look like? And then resist the urge to create content immediately, right? I know it is very tempting, especially in our current landscape, to just projectile content all the time, but listen, right? Take notes, digest what you're learning, give yourself the space and the grace to really grow into your DEIA role, right? I'm a big fan of roots before branches, so make sure you build those roots before you start branching content into the universe. Here are some of my own selected recommendations for really great books, if you're interested, right? And Jessica has this slideshow, so she can send it to you also. Don't feel like you have to scramble and write this down really quick. But these are some of my favorite books about generally DEIA, but also just sort of social justice and what organizing looks like contemporarily. And then here a recap. See, we're at the end, I promised. So we talked about today, we had shared definitions and the importance of specificity in language. So being specific about what DEIA means to you personally and to your organization. We talked about the history and the evolution of the diversity industrial complex and what that looks like in our current 2021 landscape, right? When diversity spending is high, well, kind of high, and diversity recruitment is high. We talked about the importance of finding your why, right? Finding that anchor and that lantern that will guide you in this work. Hopefully you can set your DEIA goal and you have your roadmap that you've sort of been able to maybe fill out during this presentation. And then we talked about how to identify some workplace opportunities. So how do you get involved? What does that look like? What do efforts that look generative look like to you? And so that's, now I will turn that over to you and say, I think start learning, and I will open it up for questions. So thank you all so much for your time. That's a great question. Let me see if I can get back to you. You said the champion role. There we go. Yeah, I mean, that's hard. I think it's a lifelong, so, it's part of the champion, but it's everybody's role. I think if we're thinking specifically within a workplace, right, you think about having a really clear alignment with your DEIA goals. So if you're on a committee or on an ERG, having a clear outline of like, this is the mission and vision of this committee, right? This is what we're doing. And ideally that is tied to your organization's bigger DEIA commitment and goals. So you can say, if you're on the community impact DEIA subcommittee and your goal is to increase, sort of community empowerment and belonging, that's going to relate up to hopefully your organization's core value of collaboration. So then you can arm yourself with, well, this is what we've said we want to do, right? Talking to your peers, talking to your teams and say, this is a core value, right? This is what it means for us to be at X organization. And so here's how it looks, right? And some people are going to be resistant because they are, right? People take time to come to the table. Some people don't ever show up, right? And that is okay. But I think you have to be able to fully back yourself in, well, at this organization, this is what we've committed to doing, and this is how we're doing it. And so if you're part of the organization, this is what's expected of you, right? And ideally, there's some sort of, core competencies or assessment that includes DEIA as part of your whatever kind of review you do to help, bolster those efforts. But I think it's really about trying to get very clear on what is the organization doing and what is the expectation, and then how can you communicate that to your colleagues? Is that useful? Sure. Sure. Yeah, I can do a little bit of it. So I think, one of the things that is useful, or I'll just talk about, at Castle, right? Because this is something we have done, is setting our own DEIA strategic plan, is you think about, going back to, and in the nonprofit world, this is different, right? So I should say this is nonprofit higher ed specific. I don't do a whole lot of corporate DEIA work. It's just not my jam. But if you're looking at the mission and vision of the organization, right? And so like, this is what we said we're going to do. If you're creating a, sort of DEIA plan from scratch, it's about thinking and extrapolating out from there. Well, how does equity and inclusion feature into our mission, right? And if it doesn't, that's something to tell you, right? To inform, maybe it's time for an MVV refresh. But, if it does, which hopefully it will, then you think about how can our DEIA efforts amplify and strengthen the core mission or vision of the organization. And then I'm a big fan of really trying to reverse engineer, right? So I think one of the things we did was talking sessions with individual colleagues, with groups, about what would the most inclusive version of Castle look like, right? Like, what does it feel like to be in the most inclusive version of this workplace, right? If you were designing a super equitable version of Castle, of our workplace, what does that look like for you? And then trying to figure out what are people saying, right? If they're saying, well, I really want a place where I can just be myself, right? Okay, so what does that mean? Are you looking for psychological safety? Are you looking for a team that can really welcome all facets of you? Are you looking for training and development that recognizes beyond just the function of your job? This is what you want to do. And then implementing those goals from an equity lens, right? So it's not just like, well, our colleagues say that they want, to feel more welcome at work. Let's have a happy hour on Thursdays, right? Like it's not that, right? It's thinking about what are people saying they want? How does that version of inclusion and equity support your MVV? And then structurally, what do you need to make that a reality? So if people are saying they want to feel a stronger sense of belonging or inclusion, and you think that means they want greater psychological safety, then maybe one of your goals is that you sort of have a psychological first aid training is required for all onboarding, right? Or some sort of, you have managers who go through secondary trauma-informed care training, right? Or just something. So it's figuring out how those bigger goals can be really bite-sized and operationalized. Is that useful? You can say no. Okay, great.
Thank you. And this isn't on? Oh, I know, but the Zoom, there we go. Now I can sing, but the Zoom community cannot. So my apologies to our Zoom community. You couldn't hear the questions because I wasn't using the microphone. More questions, and I will bring the microphone to you.
Okay, so I was sitting here like a sponge because started my new position maybe 6 months ago, and I don't have an official DEIA title. I feel like I'm the ambassador, the committee lead, the director, but I don't have the title. I've completely built up this program from scratch. Before I got there, there were no events. There was no sign of anything diversity and inclusion at this organization. The organization is not very diverse, so the idea of diversity and inclusion is very scary for everyone there. My question is, are there any signs, or are there just any signs when you should maybe consider possibly being a consultant versus trying to achieve that director role, where in this particular organization, there is no diversity? This is all brand new. You're creating the buy-in, you're creating the events, you're pushing it. So, this work can be very arduous. Like, it's very, very, very stressful at times. So imagine not having the buy-in yet and creating the ERG, creating the events. When do you know, when is the time to walk away, or when is it time to just consider other areas of the organization, if that makes sense?
It does make sense.
Okay.
So, yeah. And first, amazing, right? But also, I think you need to ask for a raise, right? And a increased title. I'd also say if you're thinking about it, if you're thinking about leaving, I think that is a pretty good indication for you that you need to see some kind of difference. And so what I would say, right, the sort of manager hat for me, because it sounds like you're doing an incredible amount of lift for these folks, and they maybe don't even know how much you're doing, right? Is that fair to say that people don't necessarily know the scope of the work you're doing? Right. So I would say, because selfishly, right, if I had a team member like you who was doing all this work, I would hate to lose you, which is not to say that's best for you. But if you think about, before you decide to transition or leave, I would say put together a portfolio of literally everything that you have done in the past 6 months, right, from an operational standpoint, and present it and say, look, I built all this, right? And so here's the deal. I want to be here, but I want to be here in the role that I'm already doing, right? And if they're like, well, too bad, kick rocks, then that's the information you need. I think as far as deciding to be a consultant or stay and try to do a DEIA lead, that's really challenging, right? And I know some people are, would say, oh, it's courageous to make the decision to leave. I can't tell you that, right? Because I don't know your circumstances. I don't want you to go home and tell your partner, Dr. Stigler said, quit your job, right? So I'm quitting, right? That's not my dream for you. But I think being a consultant there's a degree of flexibility to it. So the nice part about being a consultant is that you are not beholden to the organization, right? So you come in, you help them identify pain points, you design a plan. You don't care, if they're going to like you in 6 months, right? You're not worried that you're not going to get an invite to somebody's New Year's party, right? the office dynamics of, whatever like Paul and Tommy are doing, it doesn't matter to you. So that's a benefit there. I would also say the challenge of being a consultant is that you don't always get that feedback, right? So you might design a plan that's a 3-year plan that you think is absolutely aces, and then you leave after 12 months. And you don't know, like, did they implement it? Did it go well? Was there difficulty? Was there pushback? Like, what did the board say? So it's hard to hone your practice as a consultant if you're not getting that feedback. But that said, I think there's an opportunity for you to kind of do both, right? So you can start testing the waters of DEIA freelance consulting, starting with what you're best at, right? Is that training? Is that strategic plan? Is that community engagement? Start identifying some opportunities for you to do one-off events or one-off trainings, or ways that you can engage and see, is being a consultant really what I want to do? And then make a decision from there. Is that useful? Of course. And you can always email me. I'm happy to tell you more about it, because having been a consultant, I can sort of offer you some of what I think are the pitfalls, but it's not easy. So I appreciate all the work that you're doing, and I hope that your organization, sees this Zoom and pays you more dollars, is what I would like.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. This is fascinating, isn't it? Is your list like really long of what you learned? Because mine is. Starting with curb cut. I had never heard that term before. Now I know what curb cut is. And the older I get, the more I like the curb cut in the sidewalk. Jessica, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Stigler. Is there any trainings that are available that are, easy to digest, not your annual EEOC, compliance in the workplace type of trainings that would be great for the audience to hear about?
Sure. Yeah. And that's a really great question. So there are, right, as you can predictably assume, the rise in DEI has meant that there's a number of certifications, courses, trainings, right, available to you. A lot of folks I know have gone through Cornell's, D&I certificate program online and have really good things to say about it. There are some different, one-off courses that are available either through LinkedIn or through other resources. I know some universities are starting to make more, equity and inclusion, particularly in their business programs, those classes available. There's an organization whose name I'm blanking on now, but they do specifically focusing on sort of being an anti-racist educator. I think it can be more of a K-12 focus, but there are those trainings if you're interested in that. And so, yeah, there's a number of things out there, right? And so I would say, again, identifying your why is really going to help you identify the training that's most useful for you, right? Because if you are really interested in, equity and inclusion from a legislative policy agenda, like if you want to be, someone who works for racial justice and equity in a policy setting, you're not going to want to go to a training that's for K through 12 educators, right? Like that's not going to be great for you. The Illinois Department of Human Rights, they have rolled out some really great trainings on different, gender identity, on disability, on just generally DEIA. I know they started piloting that specifically for Illinois, government partners, but I think they might be offering those more broadly. So check out their director, Chris Smith, is really amazing and has a number of really great resources. So I would say just do some sort of diving and Googling around to see what aligns with what you're looking for. Is that useful, Jessica?
Any other questions? Go ahead. From the Zoom audience? Great. Do you need my microphone? It's hard for me to give it up, but I will. I will read it. Question, do you have any book recommendations for individual reading or book discussions to open up communications on DEIA?
Yeah, so here's my selected recommendation slide. And again, Jessica has the whole deck. She can share with you. I know I dumped hours worth of content on you in an hour. But here's some of my favorites, right? So Michelle Jung Kim's The Wake Up, Closing the Gap Between Good Intentions and Real Change. And she does a lot of webinars too. So good if you can catch her. Tara J. Frank's The Waymakers, Clearing the Path to Workplace Equity with Competence and Confidence. The Waymakers and both The Wake Up are really good, useful, specifically thinking about operationalizing DEIA in your workplace, right? So if you're looking for some good tips and some how-tos, Those are really good recommendations, right? Miriam Kaba's We Do This Till We Free Us, about abolitionist organizing and transforming justice. That's just my own personal bend on the work. So is Ijeoma Lewis. So you want to talk about race. So if those efforts are new to your organization, that's a really useful way to introduce those conversations. And in the fall, Lily Zhang is going to have DEI Deconstructed, which is going to be a really great sort of like primer on exactly how you do workplace work. So those are just a handful, but like I said, I cannot stress enough that there is an absolute abundance of resources, of readings, of TED Talks, of, again, going on LinkedIn and finding someone whose why is aligned with yours and then follow what they're doing, what they're posting, what they're sharing. That's a really good way to find something that's more clearly, aligned with the work that you want to do. Thank you so much.
Is it on? Oh, good. One more round of applause. Wasn't that fantastic? And remember what we said in the beginning, the more you learn, the more you realize there's so much more to learn. I didn't realize how truthful I was being when I said it, but that's for sure. And thank you, Dr. Stigler, for everything that you shared and for sharing so much of yourself and for how to reach you in the future. I'm sure you'll be hearing from many of us as we think about what you shared and as we begin or continue this work. We also encourage everyone to invest in your ongoing commitment to social justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And the slide that we have up now is related to the University of South Florida Muma College of Business. They offer a free 7-week certificate program sponsored by the Tampa Bay Lightning and Jabil that focuses on ways organizations can create a more diverse workplace, as well as address equity issues and foster inclusivity. I know several people who've gone through this. Actually, our VP of Human Resources is one and shared with me some content from it. The program does consist of 7 2-hour modules. They're all pre-recorded. You can view them anytime before December 31st. It's available free of charge. There is a fee if you wish to earn a Credly certificate and a badge. And don't forget to share your inspirations, insight, and photos from the last 2 days with the hashtag, which is Thank you, Laker Leadership Conference. And following this session is a talkback session in this space to process all that we've learned. And it will feature a few of our program participants who will share their experiences. And we will also close out the first Laker Leadership Conference together. Thank you so much.